Top of the day to you, boys and girls. I use that term endearingly, of course. I'm kind of a boy at heart, so there you go with that one. We're obviously at the bench in the shop for another little narrative session. It snowed probably 2.5 weeks in some capacity, pretty much every day where we're located. So, yeah, we've been getting a lot of snow. Thankfully, it hasn't accumulated, or we'd be snowed in or out, depending on how you look at it. But I digress. If we were to throw out the disclaimers right off the bat, narrative, long and tedious if you're not a knuckle/gearhead like myself. I'm 80% knuckle, 20% gear. I'm going to give everybody a benefit of the doubt and say if you're interested in this video, you're at least 50-50. But at least we've gotten that part out in the open. If you're not, you won't enjoy this at all. I'm going to pull this information from the depths of my cranium, somewhere back in the back, down low on the left. Lots of cobwebs in there. Please forgive me if I slur and or stammer my speech. I call that slammering. Other people make up words. Why can't I? I guess that's the way I look at it anyway. And check the description for any clarifications or qualifications, because as I bumble along through this, I will probably make a mistake or two or three. I completely, well, I don't completely. There's a litany of errors when I compared the 084 when it wasn't completely broken down into case halves to the 088. Today we have an 880. I'm probably going to use 088 and 880 interchangeably unless I make a specific notation. I'm probably going to be just talking about the 880. Even though the 088 and 880 aren't that far removed, I'm not going to get into the plastic and some of that stuff. I'm going to get a little bit further down in there as we go through this process. Got a lot of ground to cover, so let us begin. So there's a couple different published horsepower numbers for the 880 and 088, 8.5, 8.7, 8.2 on the 084. Keep in mind that a horsepower by definition is the amount of power that a horse exerts in pulling. So if you got a little tiny horse, you don't get much of a horsepower. If you got a great big Mondo Clydesdale, you get a lot of horsepower. So that term is kind of relative. It could be about about 750 watts, a little less than that, 745 or whatever, or 50 foot-pounds of work per second. I think that's a horsepower definition-wise. Torque is a little bit different. That is a rotational force. The piston goes down, moves the crank, spins the crank. The spinning motion is basically the amount of force that you get from the spinning motion. That's more like a torque concept. So like an engine spins a drive shaft, certain amount of force, that's your torque operation. So anyway, kind of digressed a little bit. If we look at the filter base, air cleaner cover, and check them out on the 084, there are a couple different versions in the 084 as well. We see there's a gap there and a little bit bigger area for the air to get in over here, and then there's just this gap right here, so that's how the air gets in. If we look underneath, we see it's a little encumbered getting the air from the air filter in through and out into the carburetor. If we compare what we have on the 088 and 880, for example, we haven't actually looked at this kind of a concept. So we're trying to figure out why there's a differential in horsepower, filter base, car box cover, whatever. If we look down in here, we can see the air goes in here and goes in here. If you have to winterize this, you can take the lip off right there, little cap. But it's pretty sweet the way the air actually gets in there. So if we think about that part of it, flow always helps. It's pretty open on both sides. So we're kind of starting to notice a little bit of a difference in the flow. This is called a flange. We take a look underneath all of that. There are a couple different versions of 084 carburetors. There's like several carburetors, the 880, 088. Seems like there are some choices in there as they progress. One of the things we'll notice, the inlets are similar. Venturis are the same 23 millimeters. It's the back side where it's dumping into the manifold. It's 26.9 on the 084 carburetor, and it's about 25 and a quarter, on the 880 carburetor. So same size going in, much smaller coming out. If we look at the intake manifolds, we'll see the same old pyramid design in here for atomizing the fuel. Big gaping hole in the 084. We'll reverse them or they sit on the bench. So if we look at where they dump into the cylinder, quite a bit of difference going on here. You can see it's really small for the 880. So if we look at the cylinders, this thing is pretty heavy. It's 1,070 grams or something, 67 grams, something like this. This is 880. This 084 cylinder is like 837 or something like that. I think that's what it ended up being. So it's quite a bit lighter regardless. You wonder about the heat sink concept. To get rid of heat, you have to have some material there to do that. The cylinder is physically bigger in the 880, so we have more surface area for cooling with the fins. If you can keep the operation running cooler, you can develop more horsepower. CC the combustion chamber. It ended up being 12.0. I CC'd a couple combustion chambers in the 084, and it ended up being 12.4 in a new one. This one, brand spanking new, obviously, and a really old one. So some differences there. Back on the intake kind of concept, we can see that it's a lot smaller where the air goes into the port. There is a hole right here above my thumbnail that's on this ledge that's independent from this lip right here is what seals on the intake manifold. This ledge is down inside there. This hole goes all the way through, so it's opening before the main part of the port opens, and it's closing after. So there's some kind of pressure variance happening in there. So I don't know if it's helping to start the draw process or what. I'm not actually sure. It's kind of interesting, though. Maybe that's what keeps the back pressure at bay. Interesting concept. I'm not exactly positive. We'll have to do some research and hopefully talk to somebody that is in the know. We're in the cool of the morning, and we're doing a little bit of a follow-up on a interesting point that I was not actually positive when I did the comparison video of the 084 to the 880. This is the saw that ran against the 395 and ended up getting its butt whipped. Pretty handily, I might add. So we got a long ways to go with this thing, but I'm actually really confident that she's going to come around. But anyway, one of the things that I noticed that I thought was kind of noteworthy is a hole. The cavity of this is the start of the intake circuit or intake port in the 880 cylinder, and they had added a bunch of material down low in the bottom, and there's a hole that goes all the way through, comes out, and it actually comes out below. Here's the bottom of the intake port, so the hole dumps in right there. And because it's all the way through, and this is actually, I'm thinking that you can see that it's recessed in here, and so it's actually not sealing on the intake manifold. There's actually a cavity where there's going to be a pulse effect. I didn't know if that was actually on purpose. They were trying to affect the flow somehow. A lot of saws did a similar situation, running the pump on the carburetors. They would run the hole through somewhere in this process, have it hooked up to the manifold, go into the carburetor. A lot of saws are doing it differently now, but I digress. It's actually to catch the pooling liquid fuel that doesn't end up going into suspension in the air as it's being drawn through the carburetor. Evidently, the sizing of the Venturi's haywire. I'm not sure. They're dumping too much fuel in there somehow. This thing only turns up to about 11,500. That's when the limiter kicks in. But anyway, we're going to take a look in here. We can see, well, at least I'm hoping that you can see, we have maximum little pyramid-shaped ridges in there. There's a big band here, another big band here. We're trying to atomize the fuel as best we can in this intake tract. Obviously, we're failing a little bit, I guess. I'm not really sure. But this hole is gathering up the excess liquid fuel and dumping it into the cylinder. I thought it was an interesting concept. It is going to have a pulse effect on the circuit in the intake tract, but I'm thinking it's probably pretty light since it's really diffused right here. But I guess it was noteworthy. I had to do a little bit of investigative research with the tech people at Stihl, and I didn't get any kind of response until after I actually shot the comparison video, so we're going to actually splice this in. But there you go. Just in the ongoing never-ending saga of R&D, questions come up when we see something new. Thought I better clarify it, and so there you go. If we look at the transfer port circuit, the start anyway, we see it's a lot wider in the 084 than it is in the 880. I like this one conceptually because the piston at 60 millimeters across the windows is very wide. Duration in the exhaust is a little bit more in the 084 than in the 880, but they're about the same width. Here's where the difference is important to note. Look at the size of the hole in the 880 cylinder. It's monumentally more impressive than what we see in the 084. So we're dumping the exhaust out, even though we might not be getting the same amount of flow capacity potential in the intake side of the circuit. So thought that was kind of interesting. There's a couple different pistons in this process. This is the latest version out of the 84 cylinder assembly. It is exactly the same as the 880 and 088, 133 grams. There's an early version 084 piston. It weighs I think 120 grams or something like that, and they're about 13 thousandths more narrow in diameter at the crown right here on the edge than they are in the main part to allow for thermal expansion. Think about a piston. They're a heat sink as well as the method of transferring the combustion pressure to the rod. So there's a couple different purposes that the well, and it's actually pumping, so there's three that you can like throw out there real quick in the process of the engine actually running. So they're kind of important in the process. If you look at them from a heat sink aspect, you always want to have a lightweight piston, but then the other side of that, if you're trying to dump some heat, having a little bit more weight, mass, if you will, maybe you're getting the heat transfer, maybe it's going to suck up the heat a little bit better. That's kind of just an interesting side note if you think about it. If we talk about the mufflers, I guess now we'll segue into the mufflers. So I'm super well pleased that they went back to their roots. It's kind of like hallelujah, two-piece muffler. It's stainless. It actually is super lightweight in the 880. The 088 had that aluminum thing that you had to clamp on. This one's got the standard 6 bolts and it falls off in the hand. I'm a firm believer, mostly because I'm a simpleton. In the KISS method, that'd be keep it simple stupid. We went back to my favorite catchphrase. 11.5 is all I could get out of this thing with the new flywheel and coil operation. You can see it's like it hasn't even hardly been run. It's been run at the factory, and I ran it a little bit, and that's the goo you get because you can't actually get the thing to run right. It's extremely lazy at 11.5, just so we're kind of thinking about it from that perspective. But again, gargantuan hole going in there, nice open cavity in there. there's a cavity right here. I'm thinking you can see that step right there. There's a cavity that the exhaust goes in through the cavity and out the hole that's about the size of a dime. I'm hoping that you can see that right there, but there's just the one. So if we look at this thing comes in, I think this thing weighs, what is it, 494 grams or 95 grams or something, so it's pretty lightweight for the size of it. If we look at the new version, since we looked at the other version, when we compared the 084 to the 088, we'll look at the second version. In this comparison, it's actually nice and open too. Actually has a pretty big hole going up through the fire screen. It has a couple of holes in there. I'm hoping that you can see the first one's about the same size as in the 880, but then we have a second hole that's underneath this little deflector here, or outlet, however you want to term that. It does have the Brutus Beefcakes casing, which is super sweet. I like the tough guy look, and it doesn't really add that much weight, so what the heck. Let's do a comparison just like almost side by side. So if we take a look, this is the muffler gasket for an 880. And we line up the holes. It's a little more narrow, the hole pattern, but it's definitely more restricted in the 084 version, which again, we already looked at that, but we're looking at it from a different angle. So that's not a good way to get rid of your exhaust anyway, like a rectangle. You want it a little more boxy anyway, I think, just based on what little I know. And lo and behold, we have some good flow. So there's quite a few things that are happening in the process with the 880, 088. They redesigned the cases. They're about the same length. The bolt hole pattern for the pull starter cover is a little bit different. Not necessarily that big of a deal. If we look at the cranks, I actually found that it's about 2 millimeters wider in the 088 than in the, 880 versus the 084. I'm pretty sure that the 880 and 088 share the same crank. I talked about like replacing that process. Yeah, not really going to work. We have a different taper. It's actually a bigger taper. If we look at the crank itself, we'll come back to this in a minute. This is the 2 magnet style flywheel aluminum for the 880, which works with the limited coil. Well, we'll get it on the right side there. Yeah, not too bright, of course. But anyway, so you can see that we have a problem. So the taper is way different. I did measure the width of the throws. In the 880 crank, they're the same width. That's about all the further I got. Based on the fact that the taper's bigger and the width is wider, the crank's going to weigh a little bit more, but we got to talk about the coolness of this crank in the 084. It's the sweetest one that I've ever seen in a chainsaw. They need some accolades. They need like a little plaque or some kind of an award for just coming up with this concept. That thing is so stinking sweet with the see-through design. Yeah, raving about the Conrod. Well, anyway, 700 grams, 43 millimeter stroke. It's, yeah, impressive. By comparison, if we take a 2100 crank and we compare them, we can see there's a huge difference in the width of the throws. If we compare them side to side, we can see there's a huge difference in the height of the throws. 40 millimeter stroke, plain old concept in a rod shape. You know, there's nothing sweet like the 084, but this weighs 838 grams, I think it is. 99 cc saw, 122 cc saws when you're rounding, and yet the crank is much beefier. So I guess I kind of didn't make my case for why I'm talking about some stuff with the weights necessarily. I had a couple of those back in the 80s. I actually had a 3120 as well. I thought the 3120 had more low end than the 084s. I always thought they were kind of like a high winder. just my personal experience using them, we used to cut some pretty good sized wood fairly regularly, kind of all the time, and you know, you'd be using a big saw like that. And one thing about the 084 was it's real narrow. You could get it in next to your torso. The short bars I used with that saw were 42s in any kind of an increment up to 60. I have 54s, I have some 56s, I think, maybe one of those. I think a couple 50s. I even have maybe a couple 48s, some weird like 44 numbers. I have some old roller nose bars. We didn't have to limb so much, and you didn't have to worry about your chain flopping off. But anyway, kind of segued off. We're coming back. I guess I should have made the case in the beginning as we are going through this that there's stuff going on. Why I kind of talked about the torque concept a little bit. We kind of looked at the horsepower aspect of the process a little bit. If you look at the 066, the old red light version, and kind of after that a little bit, they had that big old heavy duty flywheel. Those saws ran completely different when they went to the poly version. If we check out the flywheel, I was talking about it in the other video, and I'm going to try to piggyback the two videos at the same time, relatively close uploading. It's smaller. I didn't mean smaller diameter or weight-wise necessarily. I meant smaller height-wise. So 505, this weighs 535 grams. 28 grams is an ounce, so it's not a lot heavier. This is an 088. It's a poly, but it weighs like 501 or something, so it's relatively close. We have the dual magnet system for keeping the speed of the engine down to 11,500. If we want to compare real quick, the crank out of a 3120, for example, it's suspiciously close in the way it's designed to the 2100. The only difference is we're looking at the rod. We can see that there's a recess on both sides. This allows oil to come into the bearing, but it comes in at 838 grams. So a little bit more reciprocating mass than what we see in the 084. I need to pause. Okay, so we're back on track because I had to take a brief intermission because there was a catastrophe. Well, at least from the other side's perspective. Back on the reciprocating mass concept, so we've talked about some cranks, we've talked about weight differentials. Just as a side note, this is a crank out of a 288. It weighs 698 grams. This weighs 700 grams in the 084. So part of that is the rods. Super awesome. Did I mention that yet? And see-through. More aerodynamic, of course. And this is a 88cc saw technically, and basically the crank weighs the same. So I found that to be interesting. 394s share the crank of the 288 as well. We want to talk about cranks for a second. We'll throw in an 090 crank. You can see it's kind of a behemoth. It weighs about 960 grams or something retarded. So 454 grams equals 1 pound. This is more than 2 pounds of mass spinning while the saw is running. So, yeah, just an interesting side note. So we can take a look into cases real quick, but we don't have a comparison test for the 084 because the cases are split. But again, a little bit wider, which is corroborated with the base gasket. They're about a half of a 6 millimeter bolt width difference. They're both half a mil thick. If you want to look at the clutch real quick, the part number actually between the 084 and 088 are the same, and this thing comes in at about 337 grams or something like that, 340 grams, so there's a fair amount of weight spinning right there. If we look at the cases a little bit, they're pretty good size, pretty impressive. The drive side bearing, we'll look at that in a second, and yeah, I did surface the the case gasket interface on both case tabs. This is the little auxiliary wire for beefing up the oil flow in the oil pump. We'll talk about that in a minute, but we're going to look at the bearings. We have a standard 6203 on the flywheel side, and we have a behemoth bearing that goes on the drive side. I appreciate the size of that bearing, all things considered. I think the 3120 runs two of the same of the 6203 size. I know the 2100 does for sure. You can appreciate some of the thought in the Stihl. And if we look at the seals, we see we're dealing with the Mondo bearing. We have to have a Mondo seal, at least diameter-wise. One thing I was talking about in the other video when I was comparing the 084 to the 088 was the tank and part numbers and interchangeability, and I was talking about the bolt pattern for the tank. I wasn't necessarily talking about the part number being the same. Well, I was kind of, but I checked the part numbers to see if they're the same. No, they're not going to be the same. And I kind of thought about that afterwards a little bit, because the 084 has that auxiliary method for adding a little oil into the circuit, which is super sweet when you're cutting big fatty furs in the spring, because the pitch is running. Like, you can get gallons of it out of some trees sometimes. So there's a little push button on the side right here, the little black button, and that will help actuate some more oil flow. The point I'm trying to make is we have a set of 088 880 handlebars on an 084 tank. So, yeah, bolt up capacity or capabilities, I guess that's really what I was kind of running around in my mind, but sometimes that's just the way it goes. So I made a blunder there. I'm going to correct that in the description area. No, the part numbers are not going to be the same. Will they bolt up? Possibly. That's an interesting thing to me. I would like to check that out sometime. So, as we continue, I did check the clutch actually in the 880. It's suspiciously similar. I wasn't able to verify with an actual spare parts list number. And one thing that I was going to talk about was the air cleaner concept. So this is a standard HD2 of some of the later saws. This is an older version. It's what you used to actually see on the 084s. You can see that there's a lot of surface area. I prefer something like this as opposed to this. I don't even know if it's polyester or whatever the element is, but these come on a saw that they've displaced like 70.7 cc's, like an 044 440. You can use this filter. That's what you're doing. And you can also, you will be possibly, I guess, if you don't switch it out, but using this filter also on a 122 cc saw. So if there was ever something that was to make you go, that was it for me with this process. So they flew about 77 CFM, I think. Yeah, still kind of a question mark in my brain. And so I think one thing I need to segue off into is the we concept for a second. So I use we endearingly, I guess. There is no we in this process necessarily. I've been getting emails for, I don't know, a few years, and every once in a while somebody will be wanting to know how we are doing. I might have some help with the cinematography out in the woods with somebody that is involved in the process of the yarding, maybe filming, or maybe one of my boys filming, or maybe the landowner filming. But I'm pretty much doing that work myself in the shop. There is no we. I'm not associated or affiliated with anybody. It's just little old me playing in my sandbox over on the West Coast. So, sorry for the confusion. I'm using we as it's us going through the process and we're checking it out. So there you go. If we look at the oiler gear, this is the early version. It's really huge, but it's pretty lightweight actually. It rides on the crank, it interfaces with the gear on the oiler and spins the gear. So essentially what it does is it rotates the shaft, and there's a little push button situation, or a little, I don't even know what you call it, a little keeper thing for the cable, and that lets it affects the position of this rod in here essentially. But if you don't actually actuate it, it spins. It's kind of tilted the way, you can't really see it in there, unfortunately. So I guess I'm just going to have to explain. Well, anyway, it's tilted, it rotates, and it kind of does this wave pattern is what's happening in there, essentially. So, but this is really lightweight, the housing. I mean, for such a big saw, it actually has a really big hole in it, though. It puts out a pretty good amount of oil. The other thing I thought was really interesting, there's 8 of these 5x20s, I think they are. That's what holds the cases together on an 084. I thought that was really interesting. So I think I've got everything covered here that I wanted to. We kind of blew through a whole bunch of stuff in this process. Tried to fix a couple errors, like the crank isn't the same between the two saws. We explained why that is. We talked about why the high winder situation, we don't have a lot of reciprocating mass in the crank necessarily. I haven't weighed a 2100 flywheel, but they're pretty heavy. They're going to be getting close to the same amount of weight. I haven't weighed a 3120 flywheel either, or a clutch yet. We're going to be getting into that eventually. Just didn't have like some of those parts handy when I had this situation going on right here, so I thought we'd check it out. Anyway, covered a lot of ground. Hopefully I didn't bumble along too bad. Oh, one thing that's interesting though, if we were to, this is part of the process of getting a saw ready to put new bearings on the crank. We have multiple containers of parts, and so I don't know if you can, what you can see of that, but anyway, there's a lot of monkey business to get those things taken apart. And I did try with segue off for a second to verify, like if the clutch drum in the later version 084s would interface with the 088s, and I couldn't find an actual part number for the rim style. You can do the spur sprockets independently, and I didn't really go much further than that. So there you go. All right, we kind of covered a lot of ground. We kind of talked about multiple things. I'm hoping that you found this interesting and enjoyable. And thank you very much for watching. Please have a blessed day wherever you might be on God's green earth.